Good morning, everyone. My name is Luke Blackwell, and I'm with the Temple of Ascending Flame. And today I'm giving a presentation on the Antichrist. I'm going to give this presentation from a multiple different perspectives. I'll start with, of course, the Antichrist in a more traditional Christian theological sense, what the ancient church fathers perceive the Antichrist to be, as well as the biblical sources of where we get the idea of the Antichrist from. And then from there, I will go into Jewish demonological ideas, which I think will help color what the Antichrist is. From there, I will go into Friedrich Nietzsche and kind of his ideas of the Ubermensch and how that kind of relates to the Antichrist. And from there, I'm going to synthesize all these perspectives into its relevance for the left-hand path and for those who are in the Draconian tradition. So to begin with, I think we're going to start with the Antichrist as far as biblical sources are concerned. So the word Antichrist is actually only used in the epistles of John in the following verses. The Bible version that I'm using, the translation I'm using is the Dewey Rames version. That's just the version I prefer. From 1 John 2:18, little children, it is the last hour, and as you've heard that the Antichrist cometh, even now there are become many antichrists, whereby we know that it is the last hour. Who is a liar, but he denies Jesus is the Christ? This is the Antichrist who denies the Father and the Son. And every spirit that dissolves Jesus is not of God, and this is Antichrist, of whom you have heard that he cometh, and he is now already in the world. For many seducers are gone out in the world, who confess not that Jesus Christ come in the flesh. This is a seducer and Antichrist. The word Antichrist is not used anywhere else really in the Bible. And the word in Greek, Antichristos, it has a connotation of like adversity. I think in English we kind of have an understanding that anti kind of means the opposite, but it's more something that's like opposed or adverse to Christ. And within this, you can kind of see that there's not really one specific monolithic idea of the Antichrist in these verses. It's used more broadly. But as theology developed and other verses from the Bible were taken into context, a single monolithic idea of the Antichrist developed. Some of the other ideas of where we get the Antichrist as this kind of monolithic Christian theological idea can be found in 2 Thessalonians. The Apostle Paul talks about how there's going to be some kind of revolt and a man of sin is to be revealed. The son of perdition who opposes, lifted up above that is called God and is worshipped, sits in the temple of God and says he is God. It's a very vague and mysterious verse in 2 Thessalonians. But I think where a lot of the ideas of the Antichrist ultimately come from is the book of Revelation, which is the last book of the Bible. It's also called the Apocalypse. It's a book, I'll get into this in a little bit, but the word apocalypse kind of means revelation or a vision. And the word itself kind of changes in English to kind of mean things pertaining to the end times, because that's what the vision is about. It's about the end times. And this book, particularly in Revelation 12 and Revelation 13, talks about this beast from the sea with 7 heads like a leopard, with the feet of the bear and mouth of the lion. He has a head that's fatally wounded and healed. Satan gives him power, or this red dragon identified as Satan gives him power. He demands his image to be worshipped under death penalty. There's this second beast that comes from the earth that's a lamb that sounds like a dragon that imposes this cult of the beast. He's symbolically a man who has a calculated number of 666. And later on in the book of Revelation, there's this whore of Babylon, or harlot Babylon, which rides upon a scarlet beast with 7 heads. So we have all these kind of strands in the Bible. And how do we make sense of it? Well, many Middle Ages theologians and early church fathers, and then later on in the medieval period, they kind of synthesize these ideas into a single concept. So the Nicene Church traditionally harmonized these passages with the following understanding. essentially that when the gospel is preached in every nation, there's going to be this great final villain of history who's born out of fornication, and he's infused and possessed with the energy of Satan, and this is what the Antichrist is. He's like the big ultimate bad guy. Many church fathers believed he was going to be a Jewish man born likely from a Jewish prostitute or born of fornication, mocking the virgin birth of Christ. He rises to power and throws himself as God into a rebuilt third Jewish temple, because there's 2 Jewish temples that were built and that were destroyed. And in the end times, he's going to rebuild the Temple of Solomon. And finally, he's going to establish a cult of himself, demanding himself be worshipped as God in the temple, persecuting the church and putting those to death who don't worship him. And all this, again, is just synthesizing of these biblical verses, but it became the monolithic core Christian theological idea for centuries. And I have many different citations to different church fathers in my references, including St. John Damascus, who I think kind of gives the most clear-cut version. Like, he gives an Orthodox treatise of what the Christian faith is, and in one section he describes this is what the church believes in the Antichrist, and what is the Antichrist. So, however, most scholars don't think that that's probably what the Antichrist was. Many believe that the referent is actually likely Nero Caesar, who was a Roman emperor who persecuted the church and put people to death who didn't worship his image. If you take the name Nero Caesar in Hebrew, which I think is Nero and Kaiser, and calculate it with gematria, you get 666. So that's kind of that's what the scholarly consensus of what this Antichrist probably was in history from an academic perspective. Of course, there's many people who are, religious, Christian, who kind of go on the right-hand path of things, who have their own unique interpretations and exegesis of what the Antichrist is. They kind of take these verses and, their own understanding, these older medieval, Middle Ages conceptions of the Antichrist, and even modern academic scholarship, and they all kind of interpret it in their own ways. But ultimately, I'm going over these historical things. Some people might find it boring, but I think it's important because from all of this, we kind of get like a monolithic idea of what the Antichrist is and how it's used in other contexts. From there, I'm going to kind of switch gears. I'm going to go into kind of Jewish ideas of demonology, because I think it's very important to understand these biblical sources in the Antichrist, because I think many of us in our Christian culture, we have a very specific, unique idea of the demons being fallen angels. However, that understanding likely did not exist as a widespread monolithic idea at the time these biblical sources were composed. And certainly having a broader understanding of Jewish demonology, I think, helps understand what the author's intention was when reading these biblical sources. So, in Christianity, we have this idea of the fall of the rebel angels. There's this idea that 1/3 of the host of heaven rebelled against God and fell down, becoming fallen demons, and that's what the explanation of the demonic is. However, that idea is not present in Judaism, and it's an idea that developed from Enochian literature, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But basically, in the book of Enoch, I guess a little bit will be right now. In the book of Enoch, there's this idea of these angels who descend to earth and marry women and have these demonic human hybrids from their marriage. These angels, who are the Watchers, they also teach women the magical arts. They teach men the arts of war, They teach men civilizational arts, including arts, music, literature, war. And God, as punishment of them, will eventually cast them down from heaven, and they are condemned underneath the earth, where they will be judged at the end times. Okay? This idea is kind of where we get the kernel of the idea of the fallen angels, and it's something that develops later as the church kind of slowly gets rid of the Book of Enoch. But the Book of Enoch was largely viewed as like a canonical piece of scripture for centuries up until the 300s. I have many sources on that, but even the New Testament references the Book of Enoch almost verbatim in both the Book of Jude and 2 Peter. So whenever the New Testament is kind of talking about these rebel angels, they're more likely than not talking about the Book of Enoch and the story about the Watchers. Again, the Book of Enoch explains what Noah's Ark is and why God flooded the earth. The idea of sin was that it got so bad that women were now mating with demons, and God floods the earth as punishment. Also, this is supposed to explain a lot of the ancient heroic literature of the past, like some of the ancient Greek heroes. It's supposed to be a biblical explanation of that. But of course, there's many logical problematic things with this idea of the Book of Enoch, which is to say that, like, why aren't people making love with demons and having kids now? How is it that, you know, these Nephilim appear later after the flood, after God floods the earth? The church kind of noticed these logical inconsistencies and just kind of censored the Book of Enoch, and they got rid of it. But it's very clear if you look at the church fathers from like the 300s and before, they all believed in the Book of Enoch. And even the earliest church father, St. Justin Martyr, is often seen as the first church father. He very clearly believes in the Book of Enoch, literally. And it's a fascinating apocryphal book of biblical literature that I highly recommend reading. But that's just where the idea of the fallen demons comes from. And not everyone believed in the Book of Enoch. It seemed to be more of a unique sect of Judaism that followed and subscribed to it. The actual, perhaps earlier idea of the demonic or the Shadim is that the demons are more kind of like chthonic, chaotic wilderness spirits. They kind of dwelled in dark abodes, usually in trees, caves, haunted places. And the word Shadim can actually be etymologically traced to Babylonian or Akkadian mythology with the word Shadu. It refers also to kind of like lesser nature spirits, so Shadu, Shadim. The word demon is a Greek transliteration of the Hebrew word Shadim, because in Greek mythology, that's kind of sort of an equivalent term. Demon is a more broad term for spirit in Greek. It often refers to nature spirits, particularly like nymphs, satyrs, and the like. I think this is very important to understand, too, that the word demon in Greek mythology didn't necessarily have a negative connotation, and likewise in Babylonian and Akkadian mythology, the word Shadu didn't necessarily have a negative connotation either. It just kind of referred to like wilderness spirits or local divinities. So obviously, I think as Judaism developed and they incorporated these Babylonian and Akkadian ideas, and they connected with the Greek-speaking world and then the Zoroastrian world, and Jewish theology developed, the word Shadim definitely took on more of a negative connotation as a uniquely negative idea. But you see traces of this also in the Arab world with the jinn. The Arabic word for demon is jinn, but like in Babylonian and Greek mythology and Islamic theology, jinn are neutral spirits. They can be both good or evil, but they're often kind of like lesser spirits. So I point all this out because it's more likely than not that the authors of these biblical sources, when they're thinking of the demonic and they're thinking of these local spirits, they would probably have these more kind of Akkadian Babylonian ideas of the demonic, more so than our kind of current Christian understanding of the demons being fallen angels. There's also in the Bible these dark, massive, primordial entities as well that can be found in the Old Testament. The Book of Job mentions Behemoth and as well as the Leviathan. And of course, these are demons that get later categorized in Goetia. However, and I have sources that you can look in the references, more likely than not, these kind of will probably refer to these primordial nature entities that govern certain aspects of existence. The Behemoth likely was some kind of massive Shadim who was in charge of all the land animals, whereas the Leviathan was a giant Shadim that governed all the aquatic animals. And there's explicit analogs in Canaanite mythology. A lot of the Canaanite mythology that we have is fragmented, and if you don't know, Canaan is just the area of the Near East by Israel. the Canaanites. So we're kind of talking about neighboring cultures with similar languages and ideas. We have fragments from those civilizations, and there's a story about Baal slaying this divine calf that's created by El or God, and as well as him slaying Lotan, which is the seven-headed serpent tyrant. And it seems likely that Atik might be equivalent to Behemoth, or at least connected to Behemoth, and Lotan is connected to Leviathan. You can even see it in the language Leviathan, Lotan. There's very similar words and ideas. So there's also another third entity that's not really mentioned in the Bible named Ziz, who's kind of like a giant spiritual griffin who governs the air. And this seems to be connected to the Mesopotamian Apsu, who again is a spiritual bird creature. I believe he's more of like a trickster entity, or she. But that's not really in the Bible. That's just more from Jewish folklore and tradition. And there are many Jews who kind of have this understanding preserved in their tradition, particularly the more Kabbalistic side of things. If you go into Kabbalistic literature, it's very clear that Behemoth, Leviathan, and even Ziz are like primordial spiritual entities. Although certain people try to take these creatures either literally as like literal animals, or or just, again, demons, kind of going for a more goetic perspective. I'm bringing all this up because when we have these giant primordial entities that govern certain facets of our existence that are more like related to nature, and we have that understanding of that spirit, it's interesting to think of the beast of Revelation from that perspective. Again, the beast of the apocalypse is literally a beast. It's an animal of some kind, and it seems to be some kind of spiritual entity, because after all, John is having some kind of spiritual experience, and he's seeing a prophecy of things to come, and they're symbolic. So I think with that kind of understanding of the spiritual demonic from the perspective of the Shadim and the more kind of Mesopotamian idea, it's interesting to look at the book of Revelation with that in mind. I also want to point out the book of Daniel, where we get a lot of the ideas of the book of Revelation from. Obviously, whoever wrote the Apocalypse of John was clearly borrowing from Daniel. And there's several beasts that share striking features with the beast of Revelation, including a beast who looks like a lion with the wings of an eagle, a bear, a leopard, and a fourth beast with large iron teeth and 10 horns. And it's very clear if you read the book of Daniel that the four beasts represents empires that were kind of opposed to Israel: Babylon, Media, Persia, and Greece, likely in that order. Daniel 8 also mentions a goat rising from the west that covers the whole earth and tramples down the hosts of heaven. So, going into the book of Revelation, then how are we to synthesize all these ideas, right? So, clearly the book of Revelation was connecting itself to the book of Daniel by making a giant super beast that is like a super civilization, right? Because in the older book of Daniel, each of these four beasts represents a civilization, and now we have this new beast, the beast of the end times, who is kind of this conglomeration of all these beasts. He's a leopard, he's a lion, he's a bear. He has a lamb who speaks like a dragon. He has 7 heads. It's a horrible, monstrous beast. And the book of Revelation seems to identify, at some level, the beast as the Roman emperor. The book of Revelation mentions that it's about 7 kings and an 8th king who's to come. The 7 heads might be a reference to the 7 hills of Rome. And of course, the dragon in the book of Revelation tramples down the host of heaven and with his tail, whereas that's what seems to be a reference to Daniel with the goat trampling down on the host of heaven. So it seems what the author of the book of Revelation is saying is that the civilization of ancient Rome is like kind of like the worst beast that's opposed to Israel. In the book of Revelation, we get kind of symbolic ideas of the heavenly Jerusalem, and we get this kind of contrast with that and the beasts, right? And if you recall, again, to ancient, more Jewish ideas of the demonic as the demonic kind of symbolizing entities that are in charge of nature and the land, it seems to be pretty clear that what John is doing is he's identifying Rome as this giant anti-civilizational force of nature that's destroying God's civilization, that's invading Israel and wanting to conquer it, right? Just like all these other civilizations are identified with beasts or these kind of like demonic spiritual entities, right? Because again, we have in Jewish ideas that, giant super beasts governing certain facets of nature, right? Like the giant griffin, the giant serpent, Leviathan, the giant oxen, behemoth. Now we have a giant seven-headed spiritual beast that's invading Israel and destroying the temple and doing all these horrible kind of evil things. So I think what the author is clearly trying to imply is that Rome is this evil anti-civilizational force that's destroying what God's ideal civilization is, which is to say Israel. This is all a lot, I know it is, but it's all relevant for the left-hand path because these apocalyptic ideas of the beast of Revelation, they all color our idea of the devil and Lucifer. If you look at some of the artwork I have posted of Lucifer, you can clearly see there's some remnant of ancient Rome that's kind of imbued into his image. He's often depicted, particularly in Paradise Lost editions, as a character kind of persona embodying Roman characteristics. He's often naked, kind of like a Greco-Roman god, or he's wearing a Roman imperial attire. And in fact, even in just Satanism generally, we have the famous phrase "Hail Satan." It seems to be a reference to "Hail Caesar," right? Ave Caesar. And again, that's because the book of Revelation clearly ties the Antichrist and the beast to Rome. But also Satan or Lucifer kind of embodies these beastly aspects, right? He embodies, he often is depicted with horns, having these more animalistic characteristics, kind of representing those forces of nature. I think it's worth pointing out that in Judaism, and in all Abrahamic religions, Satan's kind of seen as the chief governing angel of these demonic spirits. And if you have a more Jewish or Islamic idea of the demonic as these kind of lesser spirits that often govern more natural forms of existence, more nature, the desolation, the non-civilized world, Satan's kind of in charge of that. So I think naturally he kind of takes on a lot of those characteristics as well. So when we think of the devil or Lucifer, all these things kind of come into play, which is why I think it's important to kind of be familiar with all these sources. But now we're going to move on to Friedrich Nietzsche and go in a completely different direction, because his ideas, I think, kind of color the idea of the Antichrist, particularly from an occultic left-hand path perspective. So who's Friedrich Nietzsche? He's a German philosopher who was born in 1844. He's arguably one of the most notorious enemies of Christianity and the church philosophically. And I have a citation to an article that kind of embodies the seething resentment that a lot of Christian theologians have of Friedrich Nietzsche, which I think is fitting because a lot of his ideas are about resentment. But obviously, all these ideas of the apocalypse and the beast of Revelation, they all do color our collective consciousness, particularly in Western civilization. And certainly it's influenced not only art and literature, movies and philosophy and Western esotericism, but I would argue it also influences Friedrich Nietzsche's works. One of his works is The Antichrist. One of his books is literally called The Antichrist as a reference to the book of Revelation. So I think that those motifs and ideas of the Antichrist do color his works. There are many different things Friedrich Nietzsche talked about, but I think just for this presentation today, I'm going to be talking about his ideas of morality and conception. I'll try to be very brief with it. And I want to clarify that this is a very, very short and concise oversimplification of his ideas. But I think it's enough just for the purposes today. The three books I want to point to are three books: The Genealogy of Morality, The Antichrist, and Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And we'll start with The Genealogy of Morality, which is where I think a lot of his core ideas of morality come from. So Nietzsche thought that within civilized man, I think he particularly focused on Western civilization, there's actually two conflicting moral frameworks that exist within us: master morality and slave morality. And they're actually at complete odds within each other, and they're lived out in our day-to-day lives and in our civilization. In Nietzsche's mind, when civilization started, what happened was there were a bunch of people who were the haves, who were kind of the ones who accumulated all the wealth, usually by conquest or conquering. And they had to socially distinguish themselves from those who were the have-nots, who did not conquer, who were the conquered, the slave or serf caste of society. And they did this by coming up with the ideas of good and bad. They viewed the haves identified themselves as good, while they identified the have-nots as bad. In Nietzsche, things that were associated with goodness included power, beauty, romance, intelligence, strength, victory, conquest, and so on, because those were the things that kind of gave you a standing in society, gave you standing in upper class. And it was also connected to your family. If your family was connected to these things, they can be connected to who you are. However, those who did not have such things, who are, weak, ugly, infertile, celibate, conquered, they were viewed as bad. I also think cleanliness plays a role in this too. Those who were upper class and had power were clean, whereas those who were bad were unclean and gross and dirty. But something happened called what Nietzsche calls the slave revolt, where the slaves in the lower classes, they wanted to be viewed as good. And they didn't like how their masters were kind of pushing this image on them as bad. And they created new moral constructs where they identified their own state of being as good and the ruling class as bad. So they came up with their own new ideas of goodness, while they called those upper class, leading class evil. So we went from good and bad to good and evil. Good, for those who embrace this slave moral system, include meekness, humility, purity, celibacy, poverty in spirit, right? Detachment. Whereas those who were once good became evil. They became prideful, gluttonous, fornicators, war bringers. But if you actually look at the concepts of good and bad and compare it to the concept of good and evil, you'll see that there's been a total moral inversal, and that these are cleverly constructed ideas that kind of warp the ultimate idea, right? So warp the original ideas of good and bad. So like fornication, right? Like you could argue that it is a dark connotative version of romance or lovemaking, right? And gluttony, right? That could be a warped, dark version of like somebody having a feast, right? Pride, right? Like that could be a dark, warped version of like being victorious and conquering, right? So in Nietzsche's mind, the old pagan order largely embodied master morality. But beginning with Plato and then culminating in Judaism and then eventually Christianity, Western civilization embraced slave morality, and that became normative in our society. That became the main moral system. But in Nietzsche's mind, there's a couple of things that are problematic with that. Number one, morality is in the matter of the perspective, and he gives the example of, and this is a really famous example, of a lamb being targeted by birds of prey, right? So if you're a lamb and these birds of prey are attacking you, picking at your flesh and hurting you, you might, as a lamb, say, you birds are evil. How dare you? You can't peck at my flesh. That hurts me. You are evil. I'm just a lamb who's just chilling out, enjoying life, and these mean, evil birds are bothering me and eating my flesh. But from the bird's perspective, it's just acting according to its nature. It's hungry, it sees lambs as a tasty treat, and it just eats it. It doesn't really think too much of it. It might get a thrill out of it, actually, like from the thrill of the hunt, right? They're going after conquering their lessers and doing what they ought to do, right? So what morality is kind of in the idea of the it's in the eye of the beholder. Beauty's in the eye of the beholder, right? But even so, the older pagan moral framework in Nietzsche's mind, it was life affirming. It means you are acting according to your nature and doing what is psychologically healthy. Whereas slave morality is actually a complete negation of life. You actually end up resenting some of those natural instincts and inclinations you have as a human being. Those inclinations to have wealth, those inclinations to have love, those inclinations to have power. You're denying that because that's what your nature is, and that's our inner animalistic nature and what we desire as people. So Nietzsche, he simplifies this by calling, identifying those civilizations that have this old master framework as the beast of prey or the blonde beast, which becomes problematic later on in certain political movements, especially in the 1940s Germany, who kind of take Nietzsche's ideas and maybe take it a little bit too literally, maybe take it a little bit too far. But that's a story for another time. How does Christianity embrace slave morality? Well, in Nietzsche's mind, he talks about this in the Antichrist. Judaism actually started as a healthy, life-affirming religion. If you go to the Old Testament, you have God and the Israelites conquering their enemies. They get this beautiful promised land, a land of milk and honey. There's a huge fertility aspect, right? We have the Canticle of Canticles with Song of Solomon, which is this romance poetry. God's encouraging everyone to be fruitful and multiply, to subdue your enemies, to have your own house, to ask for greater agriculture and harvests. And the Jews justify themselves by saying we're God's chosen people, that the God who's in charge of the universe put us as the chosen people, and we're allowed to conquer who we want because we have God on our side, right? But your faith in that kind of breaks down when you start getting conquered by all these big foreign empires, right? You get conquered by, just like the book of Daniel, you get conquered by the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and then the Romans, right? How do you make sense of the fact that you're the chosen people if you're just constantly getting conquered and subdued by foreign empires, right? Well, the way you do that is you maintain your chosen status, but you alter what is moral. You alter what is good, and you make your slave form of existence as a conquered people as the highest moral good. And this led to the development of slave morality, where you as a slave are the highest moral good, rather than who you were, which is a master who was conquering your enemies. But slave morality, while Nietzsche does identify some of its benefits, he credits slave morality as leading to the development of science and philosophy and Christian theology and the establishment of the university system. The idea of the scientist in his lab being kind of a celibate, dedicating to himself to his studies, or the monk who's kind of a similar character, does come from slave morality. It does have benefits for civilization. However, it is ultimately oriented in the direction towards death, because what you're desiring is a denial of your own nature and a desire towards non-existence. In Christianity, there's a desire towards heaven or things to come or the afterlife, right? But it's inherently contradictory, because heaven promises you all these jewels, these pearly chandeliers and pearly gates, gold, jewels, silver, heavenly feasts, love and intimacy with God. You're a ruler over the earth with a crown and from heaven. Though that's the images that are used in heaven, and that reveals what the psychological motivation of a lot of Christians are, because they deny and reject those things here on earth, but they desire it after they're dead. So they don't really deep down reject and not desire those things. They deep down want those things. And it reveals there's something very psychologically unhealthy with them. However, However, Nietzsche asks us to go even beyond just master morality. And thus spoke Zarathustra gets into this. Thus spoke Zarathustra. The word Zarathustra means Zoroaster. It's a reference to Zoroastrianism. He's not really speaking more as Zoroaster does. He's more playing the role of the satanic false prophet Zoroaster, rather than like a real representation of Zoroastrianism. He's kind of playing a villain in a Christian person's mind as the evil, corrupting false prophet. At least that's how I perceive Zarathustra. It's a poetic book, but it ends with the idea of the Ubermensch. And it's an idea that seems similar to the Blonde Beast or the Bird of Prey. But rather than merely just embracing master morality, you define your own moral value system and your own idea, and you embrace your life. You accept it for what it is. You reject herd morality. You reject the idea of morals that are imposed on you by other people. You overcome those constraints and you develop your own life and your own will in your life. And the ultimate goal of this is to develop an amore fati, or love of fate, to accept that in your life you have a fate and to love it. Nietzsche viewed the Ubermensch not only as an idea in civilization that will be developed in the future, as civilization progresses and we deal with these issues with religion dying and we come up with a new moral system, but it's a spiritual state of being that you can develop within yourself. And it's very clear that for Nietzsche, it's a psychological, spiritual thing in addition to a real pragmatic thing that will come into being. Okay, let's wrap all this together. I know this is quite a lot of different concepts, but they all kind of interrelate to each other. But I find that all of these ideas are incredibly important to the left-hand path and apotheosis. Apotheosis being the idea of becoming a god. Certainly one example that I think is the most clear-cut of the apocalyptic ideas, the Book of Revelation, these Jewish demonological ideas, as well as these kind of prophetic apocalyptic books like Daniel and Revelation. I think they all clearly show their influence in H.P. Lovecraft's works. I think if you look at the work of Cthulhu, clearly he's taking from the idea of the Beast of Revelation coming up from the abyss as this ancient, terrifying spiritual entity. And if you actually read the Call of Cthulhu book, it's clear that Cthulhu is kind of like this evil, demonic, spiritual entity that's worshipped by an ancient cult that brings about the end times. And he's clearly borrowing from the Book of Revelation. That's incredibly important for the Draconian tradition in terms of the entities we deal with and kind of the imagery we embrace. But even just generally, these kind of biblical church father ideas of the Antichrist, these Jewish demonological ideas of the Antichrist, these apocalyptic works, they all color our perception of the demonic and how we view things psychologically, the images we can conjure up in our minds and the entities we deal with. And certainly having an understanding of that will help us understand the spiritual entities that we're actually working with and what they represent. I think it's very clear that Nietzsche's ideas have had a profound impact on left-hand path spirituality throughout the decades as time has progressed. Certainly within the left-hand path and kind of satanic traditions, those ideas become embraced fully. I think the idea of defining your own morality, embracing your own will, choosing to become a master and a conqueror like a bird of prey rather than a meek lamb, kind of being the antithesis of a Christian. All of that, I think, colors into left-hand path spirituality. And I think it's important in terms of your own psychological and spiritual development. Cat's decided to bother me, so he's now part of this presentation. And to kind of wrap things up, though, I want to kind of go back to the Book of Revelation and the idea of the beast as this anti-civilizational force and force of nature. I want to clarify that in my mind, in interpreting all this, the beast is kind of like a conglomerate of two different ideas, both the spirit of Rome and anti-civilizational spirits, anti-civilizational forces. I don't think the two are necessarily linked. I think that's more of a Judaic New Testament idea. But when you're dealing with the Antichrist as an idea in your spirituality and your spiritual practice, I think it's very important to distinguish these two ideas. You may, in fact, when you're trying to invoke the spirit of the Antichrist or some kind of spiritual entity that embodies that, you might be invoking the ultimate primordial, chthonic, animalistic entity, and those kind of ideas that go into that. But you also might be invoking the spirit of the emperor, the spirit of the conquering god emperor, right? That comes up. These two ideas are equivocated, so I think it's important to keep these two ideas separated when you're working with kind of these spiritual forces. And I think, again, as I mentioned earlier, our idea of even Lucifer and the devil is kind of colored by these ideas. On the left, I have a photo of Black Phillip from the movie The Witch, where Lucifer is kind of depicted as a black goat, kind of invoking those kind of animalistic ideas of the devil. And on the right, I have a picture of Lucifer kind of in Roman imperial garb as a conquering force, of hell, a rebel against the monarch of God because he wants to be the new Caesar. Some more very specific things kind of going into this. I think that in my experience, the demon Sorath is a spiritual entity. It's connected to the Quifa of Thagarion. He has a gematria of 666, which is interesting. But I think in my mind, Sorath is more of a spiritual entity that embodies and governs the idea of the Antichrist, but more from the God Emperor, like Caesar kind of spiritual force. If you want to work with that kind of aspect of the Antichrist, I highly recommend working with Sorath as a demonic entity, although I would say be careful. It's a very strong entity. Whereas the demon Coronzon, in my mind, who's connected to the Quifa of Dot, I think he kind of also embodies the beast of Revelation, but he more represents kind of the chthonic, primordial, animalistic force that I kind of talked about earlier in this presentation. Again, if you want to work with both entities, be very careful, because invoking them in your life might bring about drastic changes and transformation, and both entities, I think, require seriousness on your part for that kind of transformation. And again, I talked about Lucifer and how I think both these ideas of the Antichrist as a primordial beast and the Antichrist as an emperor kind of color our perception of that. I think also the left-hand path is an exploration of the unconscious, which means the exploration of our unconscious past, right? That not only includes our buried pagan past that has been covered up by our post-Christian and Christian world, a civilization that is pagan, that worships multiple deities, but it also is the discovery of the unconscious of our pre-civilizational selves, when we had a more animalistic form of existence, before we had all these luxuries of civilization, when we were much closer in nature to the animals in our very being. And because the left-hand path is the exploration of our unconscious and our unconscious past, we are going to be encountering those deities and entities eventually anyways. Finally, I would also say that you should use left-hand path to explore your own moral ideas and perhaps deconstruct them, because you might be carrying on ideas that aren't your own, that do not serve your will or your ultimate good, usually by others who might be even against your own will and your own good. People who want to impose slave moral ideas on you and limit your true potential. Again, I want to clarify that I'm not saying we should just all be master moralists and conquer everyone that we see. I think the draconian path is much broader than that. But I think you need to be the one who defines your own moral outlook and your own moral system. And that's my presentation. Again, I apologize for my cat being kind of needy during this presentation. That's just what cats do, but I have all these citations here. That's it. Thank you very much. I appreciate you guys watching this.